Hey guys, Pastor Tanner here, and we're on part 3 of our sermon prep for this Sunday. Now, as you recall, last time we were struggling with this multiple proximity operator search that I was doing. Should near Christians near fear, and it wouldn't go even after several minutes. I did some research on the search stuff, and I actually think this is a legitimate operator, but it is taking so long because it's searching for each of these words within 48 words of the other ones, and it's just taking forever. And so I've, in the meantime, learned a few workarounds. Now the first thing I did is put the entire phrase in quotes, and you can see this will return fairly quickly, boom. And it's because it's looking for this exact phrase in all of my resources. It's a lot quicker search. And I actually found a very neat statement here in 1 Peter. So I opened that, studied the passage, why should Christians fear? That's why it returned this, is because I had put should Christians fear, and it says see verses 17 to 19. When I click on that, it takes me to 1 Peter 1, 17 to 19. Since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially, live out your time as foreigners here in reverent fear. So this gets to the heart of my point. Peter tells us to fear, and yet my sermon is going to be on why should we not fear. So I need to find a balance between what is appropriate fear and what is inappropriate fear. And so I think my 1 Peter 1:17 passage is essential to put somewhere in here. And I need to discuss it at some point. And of course, I can look into some other verses that talk about not fearing or fearing as well, like work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Let's go figure out where that is at. So we can just go Bible search. And get a fuzzy Bible. Philippians 2:12. Continue work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So the Bible does talk about fearing, and it tells you to do it, even in the New Testament age. So there's got to be something, Philippians 2:12 was it? There's got to be some sense in which we are supposed to fear, even though Jesus rebukes them for fearing. And I got to figure out what that is. So that's going to be one of my keys today, is kind of figure out the details. Is there a sense in which we should fear? I'm going to talk about verses 41 and 42, but then I'm going to talk about 1 Peter 1, Philippians 2:2, and maybe I should make these the same. Philippians 2:12. And I apologize for the sound on my keyboard being too loud. I have realized with this setup that this mechanical keyboard is just too loud, and I've ordered a new stand for a new mic that I could actually fit in, but the stand isn't here yet. I was hoping it would get here, but it hasn't gotten here yet. Let me show you my mic. I bought the Samsung G-Track Pro, and it's a very good mic. I got a pop filter for it and everything, but when this sits on the desk, it picks up keyboard sounds even more loudly than this thing. So what I've done is I've bought a mount for it where I can mount it on the desk next to me, and it can hang down in front of me, and it'll be away from my keyboard. So I'm thinking that'll be a better sound setup overall once I get it going, but I haven't gotten that arm yet, so we're still dealing with sub-quality sound here, and I apologize for that. But I just want to let you know what's going on with that. I am aware that my current keyboard is very loud, and I'm just trying to manage that. So this is going to be an excellent opportunity to talk about the different types of fear. Now the other thing I was figuring out with these searches is I was figuring out some workarounds. So let me make sure my audio is still good. Yeah, so should Christians fear is a large one. Now, when I was going through the search help over here, the Logos help, it was telling me that if I just put the words in that it would actually group them. So let's look for should, all text, all resources. You can see nearly 5 million results in 1.4 million articles. So should Christians, no separator in between. Now, if I want the search to work how I want it to, we might get the same or less results or higher results, but we want less articles. It means that the question is this looking for every time should pops up and every time Christians pops up? Or is it looking for whenever that is present in both articles? So I want less results. And you can see I get 560,000 articles, which is a lot less. And so if I type fear in here, I should even get less than 560,000 articles. 178,000. So this is actually, just typing in the words is actually performing the operator that I wanted to perform before, where it was including all of these words in the search. So we can use this to help us find some other information. This is still way too many results, 170,000 articles. I don't have time to go through all that, but we can continue to narrow this down to get more specific on what we're looking for. Christian Lenti says, I love this streaming you do and enjoy following you from time to time. Thank you, Christian. I hope you're doing well, and I appreciate you popping in and the fact that you're enjoying it. I am normally doing my sermon prep each week, and so I just do this so that people can interact with me if they like to, and they can also see my process. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. Good to hear from you. Good to see you interacting. We loved having you up last time, and really appreciated you. So take care, brother. So I've started to figure out the search operators. Now, this being too large, should Christians fear, is because I'm searching in all the text in all of my books. So I'm going to narrow this down to just heading text and large text. Let's see. Because if I narrow it down to these, it's actually going to give me results where somebody maybe titled a journal article, should Christians fear, or those words are all present in the journal article. And you can see now I'm down to 219 results and 20 articles, 19 resources. So the goal with your searches is you want to start very, very broad. And if you're having too many results, like if it's returning half the books in your library, it's too broad, and you want to continue to think of how can I narrow that search down more and more to get more valuable results. So for example, right down here, The Way of the Lord Jesus, Volume 2, Living a Christian Life. What does it say? Hope and fear should be correctly integrated in Christian life. You can see it's returning should, fear, and Christian, all of these concepts that I really wanted to present, and so I can open that up and see what he has to say. He's got a whole article here, and you can see it looked for all three words in a heading text. This is a heading text, and so that's why my search was successful in finding that heading text. So he's got a whole discussion here. Faith leads ones to fear God and his just judgment. Fear of hell always should be subordinated to hope. Fear of hell is essential for Christian hope. And he's got all of these discussions here on fear. Love arouses a childlike fear of offending God, etc. So this is a fantastic little article section. In fact, it's on page 90 of just some monograph that I have. And this is the power of Logos. I never would have gone to my bookshelf and picked Living a Christian Life by German Grins off the shelf and started to go through it. But the fact that I have the Logos search function allows me to search through all of my books, and it returned this result. So I've got a good discussion of fear right here. And we have seen that in my actual sermon that I am saying that faith cures fear. Faith actually cures fear, but here in the article, we can see faith leads one to fear. So it's not black and white. It's not as if to say Christians should never fear, ever at all, and that faith simply cures fear. But there's a balance between the different aspects of faith and fear. So if I can go back in here, I need to put something down about faith leads us to fear. And I can look it up here in that book I pulled up. Jesus himself stirs up the fear. Do not fear those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both body and soul in hell. Matthew 10:28. Jesus' warning does not mean that hell is imposed on sinners by God's choice. Its meaning instead is that God chooses to make created persons with freedom to love, and this freedom can be abused by sinning, that such abuse, when grave and persistent, inevitably results in hell, and that God reluctantly accepts this result only in the case of someone who refuses to help to forestall it. So you've got a very good discussion right here of God's judgment, fear, all of these aspects. So that's going to be perfect for my passage, Matthew 10:28. And these are the types of details that we need to suss out for tomorrow's sermon. The first thing, we need to clearly explicate for people what the different types of fear are, and what's good fear, what's bad fear, and we need to do that in a biblical manner. And then we need to talk about this concept of why Christians still struggle with fear and how they can overcome it. These are aspects that we're really going to need to go into detail on, and it's going to elevate our sermon from just being a low-level discussion about general ideas to a much deeper, more high-level thought. That's the direction we want to go. So I think we're headed in the right direction. Let's continue to do some searches on fear. St. Augustin talks about this in one of his letters. And you can see the words aren't all associated with each other. They're kind of in a larger framework. Christians should not fear the second death, eternal condemnation. So this is an aspect of fear in this commentary I have in the book of Revelation. Christians have no need to cross from this life to the next with a sense of fear and foreboding. We can and should rest secure in the finished work of Christ, our Savior and Lord. His cross is our bridge. So the second death, that's a huge aspect. So Christians should not fear the life to come. That's an aspect of why we shouldn't fear. We shouldn't fear the life to come. Should not fear the life to come. Because our eternal state is secure in Jesus. That allows us to not fear in that sense. Although there might be other aspects in which we should fear. And so we have to find that balance. We have to have a good understanding of when it's appropriate to fear and when it's not appropriate to fear. So we're continuing to develop this idea. And also, then we're going to have to answer this really tough question. Why do Christians still struggle with fear? If faith cures fear, why do Christians still struggle with it? Why is it something that's still a problem? Now, I think one aspect of continual struggles with fear is control. I think that Christians still struggle with fear because we want to be in control and we have a strong sense of control. So that's one aspect we're going to need to look into. And I think we can do a search on this as well. Hi, bot. Das bot now following. Thanks for following. Are you an actual bot, or are you a human with a bot as a name? Regardless, I appreciate the follow on Mixer. I don't get a lot of interaction, so thank you, HypeBot. So I need to look into control and fear as well. So I'm going to do, let's start with the heading text, and let's do control near fear. And we get 16 results in 8 articles. And again, we're only in heading text. So I can expand that out to something larger than just heading text if I don't get enough good spots here. So, the steps to freedom in Christ, ways you have been living under the control of fear. That's a great one. That's not what I was going for, but that is a great one. Rafe, there you are. Oh, so glad to see you, brother, on here. Able to catch the live stream. That's great. I hope you're having a good day, and I'm glad you're able to catch the stream and interact. I'm just trying to finish this up. I'm on part 3, so hopefully we can get it finished up today. So this is actually an appendix in a very small little pamphlet, it looks like, that I have. The Steps to Freedom in Christ is a small pamphlet by Neil Anderson, and you can see it's a small pamphlet because I'm on page 54 and it's already Appendix E. So he's got a couple ways we've been living under the control of fear. That's great. I can probably use this to talk about different aspects of fear and control. The next step is to determine how fear has prevented you from living a responsible life, compelled you to do what is irresponsible, or compromise your Christian witness. After you've gained the necessary insights into your fear, it is time to experience God's cleansing through confession and repentance. Confession is agreeing with God that what you did was sinful. Repentance is the choice to turn away from sin and walk by faith in God. Express the following prayer for each of the controlling fears you have analyzed above. So you can see he talks about fear in many ways. Steps to overcoming fears. It's this whole appendix talks about this idea. So this is going to be great for the practical application portion of my sermon. I'm definitely not going to use all of these things, but I can take some of them and I can implement them into my sermon with practical applications and asking good, legitimate questions. It's kind of neat that, wow, here's a fear finder. Analyze your fear under God's authority and guidance. All of these different things. Very, very interesting ideas here. I'm very interested in this little appendix. Again, I never would have found this without the search function in Logos. Let's look here as well, because this talks about how to control your fear, but a fear of losing control, this might be interesting. We also want to look into, does a need for control contribute to the fear we have? Fear of losing control, let's see. This affects many leaders who feel a legitimate responsibility to conduct meetings with order and safety. So this is just talking about conducting meetings, maybe. Contrary to popular opinion. What do we really want? The problem also affects many not in leadership. Yeah, so this isn't helpful. It might have been, but it isn't. Let's continue. Proverbs, everyday wisdom for everyone. Behavior. One of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control, of which the knowledge or fear of God puts us in possession. Let's check that. I don't know that this will be helpful, but it might be. I think it's interesting how each sermon, as you develop it, leads you down different paths in Logos. I used to have a fixed format that I went through. I would dig into this, and then I dig into that, and then I dig into this, and I dig into that. And I've just noticed that as I continue to prep sermons, that oftentimes I end up going to different places and doing different things. You can see in this study, if you've followed along with me for a while now, you can see in this study, I've done a ton of searching for almost random books in my library, and it's because I've been on a very topically oriented study, fear and faith. There's been other times I've been digging into commentaries in depth and trying to pull information out of those commentaries. And so I just think Logos is a great tool for being able to dig into all of these details, and I always end up utilizing a little different way. Here's love God with all your mind. Let's see what that says. The fear of losing control. Keeping a sense of control, thief number 2. Two thieves of the Christian mind. This might be very helpful. The empty self is a general foe of the Christian mind, but two specific thieves rob many people of the fruitfulness and flourishing that is part of a developing Christian intellectual life. In wrapping up this chapter, I shall discuss each thief in turn. This might contribute to some of the application that I can put into the sermon. He's got inferiority and pride. And then he's got keeping a sense of control. If we're going to make progress in our Christian lives, then we must defeat the empty self and take back what insecurity and fear of losing control have taken from us. Take back what insecurity and fear of losing control have taken from us. This is the first step towards making progress in cultivating the Christian mind as part of an overall spiritual journey pleasing to God and good for others and ourselves. See, this tells me as well that the mind is going to need to be an important discussion here. Submitting the mind to Christ is going to be something we need to talk about. It's not easy. It's very difficult And it's not straightforward either. Submitting the mind is like an abstract thing. Your mind is something that you're interacting with each day, and it's hard to control how you think. So submitting the mind to Christ is something that I think is going to be an important aspect of this message. And I think this little section here is going to be very, very helpful. So let's go back to the structure and try to think of how this is going to flow. I've got my matrix introduction up to here. No longer he no longer has fear because he now has faith. Because God does not want us to fear, we must exercise faith to cast it out. So that's what I'm driving at. Why doesn't he want us to fear? Well, we can see in verses 38 and 40, he asks them why are they still afraid, all these different things. Fear is a common biblical conception. There are over 200 biblical accounts of fear. And we're all terrified by different things. We all fear different things. Let's see, maybe I can move that one over. I want to talk about different things we might fear. Fear in general, impact of fear and anxiety on the life and heart, fear over certain events. So here's something else I want. I want to flesh out this idea of the impact that fearing has on our lives. And so that's the other thing I'm going to start searching for. I've got control near fear. I've found some good stuff on that. I'm now going to look for health near fear and see if there's anything about fear that affects our health. I got one hit by searching in heading texts. Just so you know, these ones here are funny. I actually have in Logos a library of early English history, and so it's really, really old documents. You can see this one published in 1588. The Perfect Path to Paradise, containing diverse, most ghostly and wholesome prayers, fruitful and Christian meditations for the comfort of every afflicted conscience. And you can see even some of the old school spellings. And that's the name of this book. And where does he say? Oh, it's right in his introduction. Knight of the most noble order of the Garter of John Phillips, his humble well-willer, wisheth the fear of God continue a health of body and mind. He continues. So that's obviously not a good hit for us. Oftentimes, I love these early American pieces, but oftentimes when I come across them in my searches, they're not as helpful. So I'm not going to search heading text. Heading text was too narrow. I'm just going to search broadly. Health near fear gave me 3,885 results in 1,600 articles. So that's probably too many results. Let's try to narrow down to journal articles first. We can go theological journals. And maybe, see now this is 64 articles, maybe there's a few articles in some of these theological journals that can actually help me on the topic of fear and health. Whether it's fear over their children's health or future, remember our curse. This might be interesting. Let's see. It's not what I was looking for, but it might be interesting. First, when preaching the Old Testament, consider spotlighting the holy women of the past. As you preach through the story of Israel, how were the women good examples, or not, of putting their hope in God as they submitted to their husbands? Did they help their husbands follow God, or did they lead them away from Him? Like the Canaanite women and Solomon's wives, encourage your women to bring all their troubles to God, whether it's fear over children's health or future, anxiety about financial security in their home, or anything else. Encourage your women to bring all their troubles to God. So that's a helpful idea, but that's too abstract. That's kind of what I'm getting at. I can get up tomorrow and I can say, bring all your fears and troubles to God. But a lot of them are going to kind of look at me and be like, yeah, I'm trying. I don't know how. What does that mean? And that's really what you're trying to do in the pulpit, is bring clarity. There are two aspects in preaching that I think we also need to get right that I haven't talked about much, but it's implicit in how I prepare everything. And that is abstract versus concrete. Abstract versus concrete. Abstract truths are things like believe, or have faith, or trust. those are things you're telling people to do, and it's all in the head, and it's kind of hard to quantify how somebody's supposed to do that. Concrete truths are things like, go back to your job and ask your boss for a private meeting and tell him you forgive him for overlooking you in the promotion. I'm just making something up, but concrete, it gets very, very specific, and it can be made up, a completely made up situation. But oftentimes people can relate to concrete truths much more closely than they can to abstract truths. And so I love to emphasize the concrete when I'm giving my illustrations and applications. So a truth like, encourage your women to bring all their troubles to God, is not as helpful because it's abstract. Now, he tries to help more when he goes into whether it's fear over their health or their future or anxiety about security of the home. But those are still, I think, abstract type problems. I want to drive at more concrete solutions, and it may not be possible. It may not be possible to find concrete solutions when it comes to this topic. We're talking about submitting the mind to Christ. That is not easy. Now, something this article brought up that I didn't even think of, but he's talking specifically to women. Encourage your women to bring all their troubles to God. It might be worth doing a little bit of research and trying to discover how much social anxieties, or I'm sorry, not social, but generalized anxieties and things like that affect women more than men. And I can kind of dig into that a little bit more, because I know generally that anxieties and also depression affect women more than men, but I don't know the specific numbers on that. But that would be perfect to put in the context of this message. Rafe, how do you pronounce your name? Is it Rafe? Is it Rafe? I've always been curious since I've been interacting with you. I don't know how to pronounce it. All right, let's continue to look through our results here. Health near fear. We're looking at the health impacts that fear could have. But don't fear, it's a win-win. Health of your church? No. With their obsessing fear of the grave, they set special store. Health prosperity? No. Notwithstanding the never-ceasing and healthful revolt of consciousness, reason, and grace, we fear the effects. Feared the effects of discipline on health. I got it right the first time. Rafe. Okay, very good. Thank you, brother. As always, I know you've seen my videos before, and I haven't been interacting much with people. It's because mostly I don't get a lot of people watching me live. So if you're interested in interacting with me, if you have questions, feel free to ask, and I would be happy to leverage my Logos library too to maybe answer any questions you might have. I don't know if you've noticed, but my style is a bit ADD. I jump all over the place, and so I have no problem if you have questions interacting with you. But I'm glad you could catch me this morning. But that strong fear that my health would not warrant. No, see, we're not getting the hits we want. Bless God for the continuance of your health, but especially for the good seed of his true fear. Let's see if Bibliotheca Sacra has anything to say. Philip Melanchthon, I fear I shall lose my health. How to handle fear, mental health, book notices. What is this? This is going to reference another book. A Woman in Her Home. This book includes former radio messages that were previously published in the booklet Happy Homemaking. New chapters now have been added for this edition. It covers such topics as marriage can be happy. Okay, so these are chapters in a book, Woman in Her Home. How to handle fear and mental health. So do I own this book? A Woman in Her Home. I might have it, I don't know. Doesn't look like it. It's Moody Press, so they don't have a lot of bundles with their books. But these would be two interesting chapters to dig into if I owned this book. Let's continue on. Adult children who watch their parents lose their health, independence, and dignity fear. No. Looking for fear's impact on health. Not getting a lot of hits that are emotional life of our Lord. This looks interesting. What does this say? Fear, of course, is a powerful emotion. There's a positive side to fear when Scripture says that you are to fear the Lord your God and be respectful of Him. There's also a negative side. Some are afraid of darkness, some fearful of the future, others fearful for their health. There's a great difference between these two kinds of fear. See, I like this. This is a simplistic way of looking at fear, but it might be good for preaching. When I went through the Bible dictionaries they give me 6 aspects of fear in the New Testament. That's just a lot. I'm not going to have the opportunity to go into each of these different aspects, but what I could maybe do is summarize them into neat little packages to describe for people the different aspects of fear, and that might be helpful. Negative fears are contrary to the peace that comes with salvation. We're told in 1 John, perfect love casts out fear. We see none of this negative or servile fear in the Lord Jesus. He was not afraid of his foes, whether they were religious authorities, Roman governors, or hostile questioners. He was not afraid of when facing pressing crowds. Unaffected by a small boat in a raging sea. That's our passage. The reason for this lack of fear lay in his complete trust in the Father, who sovereignly guided him in his ministry, the complete assurance of the Holy Spirit, and the power that was at his disposal when he required it. As noted in John 10:17-18, he could give his life and he could take it again. He was perfectly yielded to the Trinitarian program and was not afraid. So it looks like to me the fundamental sense in which we should fear is reverence for God of some sort. We've got our 1 Peter passage, we've got our Philippians 2:12 passage. So we're going to need to dig into reverence. But the sense in which we shouldn't fear is fearing about our lives, because we can trust that God sovereignly has us. That might be the answer. Let's see. Fear/reverence for God. We can dig into what that looks like. But we're not fearing for our souls. That might be the direction we should go. And we can maybe tie it into here. But I'm still stuck in my brain on point number 1. I gotta find health impacts of fear. Let's see if there's any more options in here. The other thing we could do is look up not fear, but stress. Because I think fear often manifests itself in stress. I think people stress themselves out by their fear. So if I can't find anything for health near fear, maybe I'll do health near stress. And I'm sure there'll be some aspects of health impact of stress. So far, this looks interesting. Karen Stone, a Long Island psychologist who co-chairs the Coalition of Mental Health Professionals and Consumers, a group opposed to managed care for mental health, expressed the fear of her colleagues when she recently told a New York Times reporter that current trends are destroying this field. Nobody wants their kid to be a psychologist anymore. Not what we were looking for. Putnam fears for the future of health and civil. Let's try founders. It's just a prayer. Fears confirmed. Harvard Theological. I'm just going to glance at this. It doesn't look promising, but I was intrigued. In other words, life would mean less and be less without it, and omnipotence could not repair the loss if the strand were cast out in the world. We practically say this daily. We would not vote to exclude risks or adventures. Yeah, not helpful. Looks like an interesting article, though. Nothing there. I think we're going to have to go to stress. God as your hope for restored health. Are you bitter, fearful? These are counseling ones, so these definitely might have. Food plays a role in the images of beauty and strength. It's all about food. Fear of Yahweh leads to health. Let's read that. Proverbs 3:7-8. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your bodies and nourishment to your bones. That's an interesting one. Proverbs 3:7-8. I'm getting a lot of good cross references now. I don't have room for all of them, but I'm going to put all the interesting ones down. Proverbs 3:7-8. Ill health, am I ruled by a lustful fear? Drawing out whys and wherefores of human behavior. What do you fear? What do you not want? Why do you tend to worry about it? What is this under? X-ray questions, drawing out the whys and wherefores of human behavior. Why did I do that? This might be interesting. I'm going to hold on to this for a second. Why do I act this way? This article probed the vertical dimension that guides and animates or causes the horizontal dimension. Who or what is your functional God or God? Many of the questions simply derived from the verbs that relate to you to God. Love, trust, fear, hope, etc. Oh, maybe the fear issue is simply where it's directed. Maybe it's a positive emotion. Fear, biblically, could maybe be a positive emotion if directed towards God. But whenever it's directed to anything but God, it takes on that negative connotation. That's an interesting thought. Fear only proper towards God, otherwise it is bent and becomes sinful. You know, we do this with a lot of things in the Christian walk, right? Just like he says in the article, let's see, love, trust, hope. If you're hoping in things that aren't God, that's not good. But if you're hoping in God, it is good. If you're trusting in things that aren't God, they're going to fail you. But if you trust God, that He will never fail you. If you're loving things that aren't God, obviously we mean in a higher sense, that's not good. But if you love God, then that's the proper direction of your love. That's an interesting idea. I don't want to lose this. Let me think about it. Fear, the only proper towards God. Otherwise it is bent. Becomes sinful. And we have a lot of texts already that talk about fearing God. Matthew 10:28 was one of them as well, right? Do not be afraid of those who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. See, the disciples Jesus didn't like the disciples were afraid because it wasn't God they were afraid of. They were afraid of the wind and the waves, right? They were afraid of things that weren't God. They should have known, from Jesus' perspective, they should have known that they were walking with God all day, every day, and he always had his son's best interest in mind, and so they didn't have a reason to be afraid of those things, right? See, and we also have this problem that we noted in the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery. The Bible repeatedly holds out the possibility, sometimes phrased as a command, that those who trust in God are exempt from being afraid. And that's what's going to be hard about this. I'm basically going to get up there and tell people fear is a common biblical concept. There's a lot of ways it affects us. We're all terrified of different things. And it's really gripped our culture recently with the explosion of anxiety and depressions. Fear in general, those with generalized anxiety disorder express their fear in many ways. And Jesus says clearly here that we ought not to fear. He doesn't want us to fear. Why doesn't he want us to fear? Because the impacts of fear and anxiety are that we are frozen into inaction. And we stress ourselves out. And we place our emphases on the wrong things. These are three I can just think of off the top of my head. So these are the impacts of fear and anxiety. And God doesn't want that for us. It's not His best for us. But is there a sense in which we should fear? And then we can go into reverence and all of those things. Rafe says, nice work in Canvas. That would take me a while to make. You know what, Rafe? When Canvas first came out, I was intrigued by the idea because I had just started doing mind maps by hand. My first 3 sermons I preached off of mind maps like this. I took a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and I just plotted out each of the pieces and I would draw the mind maps myself by hand, and it took me a while. And when Canvas first came out with Logos 8, when did it come out? Last year. I was just messing around with it, and the thing that I found easiest was to just go over here on this side, and you can grab, they have all of these different things, and I think I just grabbed the basics right here. There was this basic arrow, and I just clicked it, and I brought it up here, and you can color them. So I took this arrow and I colored it, and I realized that these preset colors were exactly the sort of things I needed, and then all I did was save them to my favorites bar up here. So I can take this preset arrow here, let's say I made a black one, and I could just put it right up here, and boom, it's in my favorites now. And every time I click that, it would just make another copy of that one. So that really helped the process for me, is when I made all of these favorites, and that made it very easy. I've got my favorites for my typical statements that I use, and then I've got my favorites for all of the colored arrows that I use, and that's helped me out a lot. Now the question is, how do I delete a favorite? Since I made this one just for demonstration. There we go. Save. And so yeah, I just made each of these favorites. I've got a few text boxes and a few arrows, and then I just bring up new ones when I want, and I move them to where I need to, and then you can just copy and paste them, right? So let's say if I want another yellow arrow, I just copy, paste, and then I can move it around and use it as I see fit. So yeah, it's an interesting tool. I think some people were more disappointed with it. I read one member of the Logos forums comment on how he thought the Canvas tool could have been implemented better, but for what I do, it is exactly what I need. If I can go to an old Canvas and just show Effective Kingdom Witness. This was last week. And boom, here's what a finished one looks like. I've got all my main points. I've got all these. These are just bullets for me, essentially. Really, the mind maps are just, it's just a bulleted list, but it's set in a visible framework, a visual framework, so that I can follow it. And then, of course, I've got my quotes and my illustrations in purple, and then I've got my applications in pink. And so that's how I do them. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. I've never met another pastor who preached using mind maps, but I took a mind map course on Udemy a couple years ago now, and I just really liked how they looked, and I thought, I'm going to try this. I'm going to make one, and I'm going to try to preach off of it, and I haven't turned back since. Rafe says, very good. I mostly use Canvas for phrasing. I need to sit down and figure it out. Yeah, it's interesting. Even some sentence diagramming might be interesting because you can import the different biblical texts. You can import the Hebrew and the Greek and parse it and all that type of stuff. So I think it could be a powerful tool. There could be more to it, but for what I use it for, it's very, very helpful. Okay, so I think I'm getting to a good direction on this. I do want to maybe find some statistics on fear and health if I can. And if not, I will settle for stress. Fear and stress. I like this article. This is insightful. I'm going to read more of this too. But let's look into fear. We've got health near fear. Do I think any of these? Let me just glance through a couple more of these. I don't want to turn back on any of them. Desires for health, fears of death, fears about potential health problems. No, I want fear that is a health problem. We're close though. Then we have to fear economic slavery, fear the Lord and depart from evil. It shall be health to thy navel. That Proverbs quote again. Health, mental health, dread fear of death or ill health. Yeah, let's go stress. Stress near fear instead of stress near health. Because it'll be an easy homiletical jump to say, hey guys, we're not supposed to fear. One of the reasons we're not supposed to fear is it stresses us out. And here are some of the negative impacts of stress on your life. People will fall, like I won't need to prove that. People will believe that right off the bat. They'll recognize, yeah, fear does stress us out. So let's see if health near stress. No, and that's a book review, so I would have to dig into the book. Stress health professionals. Here we go. Today, the linkage between mind and body is becoming better understood. Knowledgeable people today do not scoff at the propositions of interrelationship. Mental health and physical health are related. Stress or depression can be the causative mechanism in organic disease. Other findings show that moral development depends in part on mental development, that social development goes hand in hand with emotional development, and so forth. That might be an interesting idea, just to show people that these things are all linked together. Let's see what this says. Experiencing stress overload may collapse. Health workers sometimes stresses help. Mental health, sometimes even. Yeah, not what I'm looking for. Health and stress in an early Bronze Age population. That sounds interesting, but not helpful. There's hardly a mention of physical health and healing. He stresses that on the cross. No. No. Let's check this out. Bishop Mounser could easily have camouflaged his resignation in the way that people often do. He could have pleaded the burdens of office or the dangers of stress and ill health. No. I'm telling you, we're going to find something. I might be down to a good old Google search if I can't find something in my Logos library. Large body of scientific research suggests that mindfulness has a positive impact on a variety of mental health symptoms such as stress, anxiety, and personality disorders. The research shows that changing an individual's perception and mindset about reality, even such things as oneself, other people, physical health, and mental disorders, improves brain function and one's health. For example, anxiety is not necessarily seen as a problem. It is only a problem if one thinks that it is a problem. In other words, if anxiety is viewed from a different perspective, one is changing reality. But what does the brain have to do with mindfulness? This is interesting. This might be very, very helpful for people. This, I think, is why therapy works. Because you're helping people change their perspective, their mindset on things. I might not quote this whole thing, but it's important enough that I want to have a piece of it here. So that could maybe come up here. How does faith cure fear? Faith cures fear because it's a change of perspective. It's a change of perspective. How can people change their perspective? See, that's not easy. Changing your perspective is not easy. You know what's interesting? Two things that cause me to change my perspective most are reading and interacting with other people in a healthy dialogue. And I think in today's day and age, technologically advanced age, all of those things, we read less and we interact with people in dialogue less. I wonder if those are partially related, at least, to the growth and development of depression and anxiety in our culture today. The fact that the two things that help us most change our perspective are also two things that are more minimized than they've ever been in human history. It's an interesting thought. What was starting out as a very simplistic, straightforward sermon on fear and faith, where essentially all I have to say is, God doesn't want us to fear, exercise faith to cast out your fear. That's all I wanted to say. What it started out as a very simplistic sermon is now developing into a much more complex discussion of what sorts of things are we afraid of? Why doesn't God want us to be afraid? What does fear look like in relation to God as compared to other things? And how, practically speaking, can we exercise faith to cast out fear? I like where this is going. Now, you can see I've got a lot of disparate thoughts and ideas thrown around here, so I should probably stop reading and gaining ideas, and I should probably start formulating and compacting stuff. And I can flesh out more details in the future if I need to. I like the intro. I think it's good and done. Why doesn't he want us to fear? Verses 38 and 40, where Jesus says, why are you still afraid? I can talk about biblical concept of fear, over 200 biblical accounts of fear. The impact of fear and anxiety, I think, is probably why he doesn't want us to fear, because of the impact it has. So let's start boiling this down. Impact of fear and anxiety. And I could just talk about these ones generally. I can provide good illustrations for each of them to grab people's attention. And and then fear over certain events. So I have fear in general and fear specifically. Why doesn't he want us to fear? There's general fear and there's specific fear. He doesn't want us to do either. So let's go down here with these. So here I think I can talk about, I think we're talking about two things. I think we're talking about people who have a fearful spirit in general and struggle with this in general, and then some people who have fear over certain specific things. Let's say you're not a fearful person in general, but your grandma gets cancer. You're going to have fear that the therapy isn't going to work, that it's going to take her from you before you were ready, you know, all those types of things. So, where would it be appropriate to talk about two different types of fear? Probably here. I probably need to put that over here, because here's where I'm talking about the different types of fear, and I'm going into more detail. So maybe this goes here. Why doesn't he want us to fear? First, Jesus says, why are you still afraid? Obviously, he doesn't want them to fear. He explicitly tells them not to, right? Why are you still afraid? Let's go see. Mark 4. Jesus was on the stern. The disciples woke up and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He said to his disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? So he clearly doesn't want them to fear, at least in this situation. And I'll go into the details. So why doesn't he want us to fear? You can see clearly he doesn't. He says so in verse 40. And fear is a common biblical concept. There are over 200 biblical accounts of fear. Now I think what I need to do is, in order to follow this logic, I need to then go into some of the accounts of biblical fear, some of the ideas of fear in the Bible. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to do a general Bible search in all passages, Old and New Testament, and just for fear, or no, let's do afraid. Passages where it says they were afraid. And let's just look generally at what the Bible has to say about it. Adam was afraid because he had sinned. Abram was afraid. Sarah afraid. So already afraid in the presence of God or divine beings. Afraid to stay in Zoar. Hagar was afraid. More aspects of Abraham being afraid. Don't be afraid. I will provide. Yeah, so what I could say here is that fear is a common biblical concept. There are over 200 biblical accounts of fear. And I can essentially say, sometimes people are afraid of God or angels. Sometimes people are afraid of others, right? God or angels. Other persons. See, we had explicated all this before. These are generally aspects of fear for others. Character and the works of God in the Bible. Other persons. Death and calamity. People and their actions. Warfare. End of history. Life to come. Calamity. Life to come. So these are aspects of fear that I can say generally. And then I can say, the fact of the matter is we're all terrified of different things. Fear is something we're all affected by, but we're all affected by it in different ways. And it's different things that actually cause us to fear. We're all different from each other in that sense. And then I could go into, so that's kind of generally what fear is about and a biblical overview of fear. Then I can talk about what fear causes us to do, or what fear does for us, or how it affects us. Noel, the retro nerd on Twitch, says, Hi there, Noel. I'm glad you could join us here this morning. So, for those who don't know, I just do my sermon prep. I'm prepared for my sermon that I preach tomorrow. I'm a lead pastor at my church, and this is my sermon prep process. I would normally be doing this without streaming, just on my computer by myself, but I figured why not stream it and interact with people. So, welcome, Noel. I hope you find it instructive or interesting. Please feel free to ask me any questions in the chat, and I'd be happy to interact with you. Don't feel like you're interrupting. I love talking with you guys, so welcome. So, now that I've got my different aspects of biblical fear, I can talk about why God doesn't want us to fear. Well, fear hurts us in three ways. It freezes us into inaction, we stress ourselves out, and we place our emphases on the wrong things. And so I can talk about each of those aspects of fear and anxiety. I'm going to have to move this red one over, I think. Got too many notes, guys. It's going to be hard to organize all of these. I guess that's half the fun. Okay, so I got more room now. Impact of fear and anxiety. I think I want to separate these out to make them three. Maybe I separate this out one more time. Okay. And I know I was digging into the impacts of fear and anxiety with my searches on stress and things like that, but I've got a lot of stuff at this point, and I think these concepts will be relatively easy for people to grasp onto. Whenever you preach, you have a three-step process that you go through, and then the first of those three steps is also broken down into three steps. So let me use this blank canvas, and I will show you guys. Whenever you preach and you get to a main point, you need to do three things. You need to exegete, in other words, explain. This is your argument, right? Then you need to illustrate. Illustrating does two things. First of all, it motivates people to feel like they can do what you just exegeted. And then it also gives an example for people to clarify. And then you need to apply. You need to exegete, illustrate, and apply. Now, under exegesis, which is the majority work I'm doing right now, is trying to explain ideas, there are also 3 main points. And these ones are state, place, and prove. State, place, prove. Now, what do I mean by state, place, prove? Well, first you state a truth. Jesus is the Son of God. Then you place that truth in the text. Here in John 3:16, we can clearly see that John says Jesus is the Son of God. God sent his only begotten Son. And then you prove it. You explain it and show it. So state, place, prove. That's the process you go through when you're trying to teach a truth. Now, the reason that's important is this is the guts of what you're arguing for, this state, place, prove process. You're saying something is true, you're placing it in the text, and you're proving it to be true. The cool thing is, you only have to do this enough to be persuasive. You only have to do this enough to get people to see your point and understand what you're talking about. Once you've got them to that point, you don't have to continue to labor in the state, place, prove process. And so, the reason I did all this just now, right here, I came up with 3 impacts of fear and anxiety in our lives. It freezes us to inaction, we stress ourselves out, and we place our emphases on the wrong things. I don't have to state, place, prove necessarily each of these individual points all the way fleshed out, because the details are things that people would readily accept. You have to spend a lot more time state, place, proving if you're saying something controversial. But if you're saying something that people will generally accept and you think won't be very controversial, you don't have to spend a lot of time on the state, place, prove. And so I'm okay with just kind of going with these general ideas because I think most of them are fairly self-evident. So that's the direction I'm going. Noel says, but isn't fear partially good? Like we can fear hell and the devil, and therefore we do everything to be a good Christian. We should do that anyway, but the fear for unending suffering helps a lot of people become a good Christian before they are. That's a great point, Noel. And I'm glad you said that, because what I want to talk about initially, my leaping point for my text is Mark 4:35 to 41. Let me show you that one real quick. Mark 4:35 to 41. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious swell came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him." So this is my jumping off point into the topic. And you can see in our passage, fear is negative. But you're 100% right, because we also need to relate the concept to the rest of the Bible. And so in point number 1, I'm going to talk a bit about how God doesn't want us to fear, but I'm making an implicit assumption in point number 1. I'm essentially assuming that this is the bad fear. And then in point number 2, I'm going to back into this concept that fear is also good. And I've got 3 passages related to that. 1 Peter 1:17, Philippians 2:12, and Matthew 10:28. And so I will say, wait a second. God doesn't want us to fear. It's bad for us. But there is a sense in which God wants us to fear. What sense is that? And I'll go to these other passages and flesh out that detail. And it's generally, so far as I can tell, I'm continuing to study right now, but it's generally fear and reverence for God that is a good thing. Not fearing for our own souls or say for our own eternal state selfishly, but fearing and reverencing God for who he is and what he has done. And then I can flesh out this idea in which we are supposed to fear. And finally, I can kind of go to a more application-oriented point of how does faith cure fear. So I think that's how the whole message is going to flow. You're right. In the first point, I'm kind of assuming that fear is bad, but I think people will follow me along because of the text. The text assumes that fear is bad. And then I can bring in the rest of the Bible to explain. Really good question, Noel, and I appreciate the interaction. That's very helpful. So I'm just going to state each of these, and I don't think I have to spend much time placing and proving them, because I think they're mostly self-evident. I think people are mostly going to agree with them. And if anyone out there is struggling with fear, I think they will have a good sense of that. So 3 ways that fear and anxiety impact us, and I can talk about each one individually. Oh man, this is getting a little packed. Noel says, thanks for the answer. No problem, Noel. I really appreciate the interaction. Very helpful. All right, so first, fear freezes us into inaction. Second, fear stresses us out. And third, we place our emphases on the wrong things. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on these, because all I'm trying to do is get people to see, yeah, God doesn't want us to fear. And then I'll hit them with point number 2, and we'll talk about the different conceptions of fear. I don't like how that arrow's interacting. Boom. Frozen into inaction, stress ourselves out, place our emphases on the wrong things. Now, I've been doing a lot of talking up until now. One thing I try to do in all my messages is I want to have as much pink and purple as possible. Pink are my illustrations, and purple are my applications. Illustrations are the things that help motivate people and they help them to see things, and then applications give people things to do, gives you a call to action. You don't want to talk for too long without illustrating or applying. If you talk for too long without illustrating or applying, you begin to sound like a seminary lecture or something like that. So I don't want to do that. So here I would have talked about this, I would have talked about all these different intellectual aspects, and then yes, I give myself opportunity here to maybe speak a little bit to illustration. Hey, we're all terrified by different things, and I could maybe put down a couple things that tend to terrify people. Maybe raising our kids, or doing well at work, or help for our family. I'll just put those down right now, real quick. Kids, work, health, those sorts of things. And so that gets people thinking. They're like, oh, okay. And they're starting to relate it to their own life. Oh, fear isn't just when somebody runs into an angel and it freaks them out, but fear is something I deal with too. Then I'll talk about these impacts. Fear impacts us in these 3 ways. And so what I want to do now is I want a pink or a purple to come off of each of these. That's what I'm thinking, because I don't have much pink or purple thus far. So first, fear freezes us into inaction. And a pink or purple here might be something as simple as, think of a movie you watched when somebody was afraid and they literally couldn't move. What was that like? It was terrifying. The music was building, it was tense, it was scary. Now, we do the same things, but we don't do it necessarily in a physical way, but we do it in a mental or spiritual way. We also, when we see something terrifying, we freeze and we stop still. This may look like in your life you are not pursuing those things you know God would have you to pursue. You see what I mean? Just the fact that I've illustrated it in a metaphorical way helps you to relate it, and you're like, oh yeah, I know what that's like. And so actually I liked what I just came up with, so I'm gonna go with that. Frozen into inaction. And let me put down this right here. Scary movie is what I'll just put, because I'll know immediately what that means. and I'll be able to start telling the story the moment I see that little box. I'll be like, oh, now I'm supposed to go into telling the story. Hey, remember the last scary movie you watched? And then I can go into it. So it freezes us into inaction. And then I can make this more of an application. It's not quite an application yet, but it's close. I'll put it anyway. We do the same thing mentally. An application is usually something to do. This is not necessarily something to do, but there's going to be implied something to do. The implied something to do is don't do this thing, right? But we'll go into that more detail as we go. Also, we stress ourselves out. Here's where I want to get into health, the health issues of stress. And I'm sorry, let's go through a couple more here in Logos and see if we can't find the health things associated with stress. And if we can't, we're going to Google, bud. Benefits of health of man, stress and mental health. We have a customary wish for health, but stress. What's this say? Individual action alone will not bring about God's righteousness and justice that leads to well-being. This can only be done in community. We deceive ourselves when we think that our personal efforts to exercise, eat right, control stress will solely determine our health. Good truths, but not what I'm looking for. Health broke down under the stress he had imposed on himself. Yeah, I think I'm done doing that, guys. Stress. Let's see. You see on my 4K monitor how tiny it is. Stress and health, how it affects your body. Very well, mind. Types of stress. Stress can be defined, blah, 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 acute, I don't care, how your body responds. During this reaction, certain hormones like adrenaline and cortisol are released. So I can talk about the fight or flight response, and I can talk about serious acute stress like being involved in a natural disaster, heart attacks, arrhythmias, sudden death, associated with heart disease, yeah, this is perfect. So fight or flight response. I think that will preach pretty well. Fight or flight. Heart starts beating fast. You're looking around for a way to escape. I can just generally talk about heart disease, anxiety and depression, diabetes was there, diabetes and ulcers. Diabetes, ulcers. And I'm just picking out ones that I think people will generally recognize or maybe even relate to. And essentially, I'm going to say something simple like God doesn't want you to be stressed out. Like, that's not a goal of His. It can be healthy at the right time, but if we're always doing that, it's not what God would have for us. And finally, fear and anxiety places our emphases on the wrong things. And part of the reason I put this is I've been talking a lot in the last couple sermons about the kingdom of God and how important the kingdom of God is for Christians and all that type of stuff. And so here, all I'm going to essentially say is, how can you be going about the work of the kingdom? How can you be going about the work of the kingdom if you are fearful all the time? And that'll be my last piece here. Kingdom work. There's kingdom work to be done. And if you're being fearful about stuff all the time, you're not doing the kingdom work like God would have you to do. So it freezes you into inaction. We stress ourselves out, and we place our emphases on the wrong things. Okay, I think that fleshes out point number 1. I've said God does not want us to fear. We must exercise faith to cast it out. Why doesn't He want us to fear? I talk about what the Bible has to say about it, and I start to relate it to real life, and then I just give some negative impacts that fear has on us. Fear and anxiety lead to these 3 negative things. God doesn't want that for us. He wants us to be effective for His kingdom work and ministry. Okay, but wait a second, Tanner. Doesn't Proverbs say the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom? What about that? And then now I can start to talk about, okay, well, there is a sense in which we are to fear, right? And I've noted verses 40 and 41 for this, so let's just go look real quick and see if 40 and 41 play this out like I was thinking. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other. So I can talk about how their fear changed here a little bit. So that's interesting. And then I can talk about these other Bible verses. So I'm saying He doesn't want us to fear. I'll read these Bible verses and say, you can see there are different types of fear. Different types. First, Jesus says, "Why are you afraid?" And then afterwards, they're terrified, and they're terrified for a different reason, because they don't understand who Jesus is. Different types of fear. So I'm actually going to put that in. So here's what I'm going to... put different types of fear right here. So I'm using those 2 verses to prove there are different types of fear. They're afraid because they have no faith. They're afraid of drowning. And then they are terrified because of Jesus. Something about Jesus terrifies them. And that's another type of fear. And then I can go to, and there are a lot of Bible verses that talk about a good fear. 1 Peter 1:17 says that. Philippians 2:12 says that. Matthew 10:28 says that. So we have to nuance this and say there's a sense in which we are supposed to fear, and there's a sense in which we're not. What do those look like? And I can get rid of all these. That's taken up a lot of room, because I've essentially broken these down into these ideas over here. So that helps a lot. And it might be too early to reveal the point there. Might be too early to reveal this point as well. So I'm just going to read these, and I'm going to say, okay, so here fear is good. We're supposed to fear for this. We're supposed to fear for our salvation. We're supposed to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. We're supposed to fear the one who can throw our souls into hell. Now, how does the logic of the argumentation go? Rich says that's a helpful observation in the text about their fear. Yeah, I don't know what made me think of that, but I was just kind of struck. He says to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid?" They wake him up. "Don't you care that we're drowning?" They're afraid of the storm. And then verse 41, they're terrified after they're like afraid in a different way. I wonder if they're different. I wonder if they're different Greek words. Ephabathasin, and I think they are. I'm not even seeing this one. Yeah, deloi. So delos, cowardly, timid, or fearful. And then phobos, phobeo, the verbal form, be afraid or to fear. But they're different. Maybe they're different because they're a verb versus a adjective. Let's look this up in BDAG and see if there's an adjectival form of this. Where are you, BDAG? Oh, I need to do lemma. Denos? No. They're still verbal. Yeah, it's interesting. Even if I'm not proving it from a Greek standpoint, I could dig into that a little more. I'm going to be honest, I don't find Greek and Hebrew studies, going in depth into word studies and things like that, to be super helpful for sermon prep. I like it, and I want to spend time looking in the Greek and Hebrew, but oftentimes it's not as insightful as it could be because of the semantic domains of different words. I think a lot of people play up the ideas of, say agape versus phileo versus, all the different types of love, for example. And the same thing might be the case here. But I think even if it's not present in the Greek, they are different words. But even if it's not present in the Greek, you can see it present in the text. They're afraid in one way, then they're afraid in a different way. So, and I think that'll resonate with people too. Now, my question right now is how I go from these types of fear. I've just explained, hey, there are verses where there are ways in which we're supposed to fear. So maybe which fears are healthy and which aren't. Might be good to just ask that question. Because now I've thrown a monkey wrench into what I've just been teaching on. I've said God doesn't want us to fear, and then I've shown some verses where it says we should fear. So now I have to ask the question, which fears are healthy and which fears aren't? And it feels cliche, but it seems to be that fear for God is okay, and fear for everything else doesn't seem to be okay. Dictionary of Biblical Imagery. The Bible repeatedly holds out the possibility, sometimes phrased as a command, that those who trust in God are exempt from being afraid. So now I think we need to look into the phrase, the fear of the Lord, and figure out what that means. I bet we can find that in the fact book. I got a lot of books open. Like I said, it's funny where Logos will take you, even if you're just studying, right? You're not even writing a sermon. You're just poking around in here, looking up ideas and things like that. You can end up in a lot of interesting places during your study. Let's try the fact book. And surely the phrase fear of the Lord has got to be a topic. It's a very, very common biblical theme. Fear of the Lord. Boom. Let's see what this has to say. Dictionary, Old Testament, Wisdom, Poetry, and Writings. This is going to be good. These IVP dictionaries, there's 8 of them. They're all really good. Let's see. Fear of the Lord is a major theme in Psalms and wisdom literature, not found in the other books considered in this volume. terminology. Rafe says, most people abuse word studies because they have never read on the subject or read exegetical fallacies. Exactly, Rafe. Once I read D.A. Carson's exegetical fallacies, I immediately recognized that that's a problem. And that you hear that all the time. You hear that all the time. People using agape, phileo, eros, and saying that these are different kinds of love and all that type of stuff. And it's like, no. Words have ranges of meaning. Semantic domains are ranges of meaning. And what a word means in an individual sentence or text is dependent on its context. It's clear as day. And that's how we use words in everyday life. But people, it's hard. People don't read their Bibles that way most of the time. People don't read their Bibles that way. And it's very, very difficult. I was teaching a Bible study last week, and I probably might stream my prep for the next one, but I was teaching a Bible study, and we were talking about a controversial topic. And we got stuck on word studies. We got stuck on, well, is that the same Greek word as over here? Is that the same Hebrew word as over there? And I just kind of, was like, all right, we need to talk about this at a later date, because getting into those aspects of semantic domains and understanding is very difficult for people, and it's hard for them to understand. So I'm going to pick that up for next time I go into that study. But yeah, no, it's a very good point. Proverbs, fear of the Lord. I just want to know what the fear of the Lord is. Job. This is so detailed. I love it. Conclusion. How not to do research, guys. Let's just scroll to the bottom and see what they say in the conclusion. Thus, the fear of Yahweh Elohim is a major theme in Psalms and wisdom literature. Indeed, many, though not all of the Psalms in which fear of Yahweh Elohim is found may be categorized as wisdom Psalms. Fear is a virtue that leads to piety, praise, and humility, since one who fears God recognizes that God, not oneself, is the center of the cosmos. There's the essence of it. The fear of the Lord is important because you are recognizing that God, not oneself, is the center of the cosmos. I'm going to copy this one. And I could have read through all those details. I'm telling you, those are really good dictionaries. The IVP Black dictionaries. There's 8 of them, and they're all really good. Okay, so fear is appropriate when it recognizes that God, not oneself, is the center of the cosmos. Now, how do we relate that to 1 Peter 1:17 and Philippians 2:12? Because it's not self-evident that those Philippians 2:12. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. I think verse 13 explains why you work out your salvation with fear and trembling, with the understanding we just gleaned from the IVP dictionary. You are fearful in how you work out your salvation because it is a work you are doing alongside of God. For it is God who works in you. And he's fulfilling his good purpose, not your own. Again, it's putting God at the center of the cosmos instead of yourself. So I think that explains verse 13 perfectly, or verse 12 perfectly. Oh, I opened Kindle on accident. All these buttons are tiny on 4K. Absolutely tiny. Is this it? Unpacking data. Close. No, don't do it, Kindle. So, verse 13 explains verse 12 in light of this concept. Go away, Kindle. Already got enough programs running right now. Let me just put Philippians 13 explains 12. Why do you work out your salvation with fear and trembling? Because it is God who works in you. And fear or reverence for God is what makes the difference between a godly fear that's good for you and ungodly fear. You need to close Kindle. Okay, let's now look at 1 Peter 1:17 and make sure that that one relates as well. Since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially, live out your time as foreigners here in fear. Since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially. For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. Be holy, for I am holy. It's again a relation back. This one's not as clear, I think, as Philippians, but it's a relation back to God's plan, his purpose, what he's doing. That's part of why you're supposed to be fearful and acting it out. So I'm okay with that. I feel confident with that I'm not doing damage to the text, that I'm not trying to twist the text to suit my purpose. I'm going to get rid of the piety, praise, and humility and just say one who fears God. One who fears God recognizes that God not himself is the one at the center of the cosmos. And I'm going to use this whole quote. Who wrote that? No, it was in the IVP Black. Tremper Longman. Lo and behold, Tremper Longman. Who would have thought? He's a very good scholar. Tremper Longman the third. Very nice. So, we've talked about God doesn't want us to fear. We've talked about there are some fears that are healthy and good and some fears that aren't. And then we've got our quote where fear and reverence towards God is something he desires of us. So I'll throw that in there. And I'm just going to put 213 here. And then I'm going to stick this off to the side. I feel like it can fit right here. It's getting cramped, guys. It's getting a little cramped. It's okay. We got lots of good stuff. So we'll throw this up here. Okay. So now I've argued that fear and reverence for God is an appropriate fear. That's the biblical fear that God would have us to have. Whereas fear for essentially anything else is no good. And this is the essential aspect of the fear of God. It's not like just being afraid of God, the fear of the Lord. It's not just like, oh no, I'm scared of him. But it's more, I think the phrase fear of the Lord, I think the concept that is being promoted in Scripture as a good fear or a right fear is a fear of recognizing one's position in the universe. God is supreme, I am not. He is creator, I am creature. That is an appropriate level of fear. It's not necessarily like I'm afraid of him in a specific instance. And even like when Jesus says, be afraid of the one who can throw your body and soul into hell. It's not that you're supposed to be afraid of him. It's that you're supposed to be in awe and respect of his position and authority in the universe. And so, I think that explains the sense in which we should fear. Now where am I going? Now, how should my argument flow? I've essentially said, yes, there's a sense in which we're to fear. Should not fear the life to come, not fearing for souls or eternal states. Should this be where I explain this idea? Fear is only proper towards God, otherwise it is bent. I love that, Rafe. Rafe says, a recognition of the creator-creation distinction in one's worldview. I think that, it sounds like a more complex way to put it, but I think that essentially is the fear of the Lord. And I think all these biblical passages we're talking about that stress and emphasize fearing God and how good it is essentially that. Recognizing the creator-creature distinction. If you understand the creator-creature distinction, that is a proper understanding of fear. Going back to Philippians 2:13, conjunctions like for in a passage usually give a reason or explanation. Learning basic Greek grammar will help one read an English Bible more intentionally. Yeah, that's good. I've taken one Greek class. I haven't finished Greek 2 or Greek exegesis yet. So I'm actually still in the process of completing my MDiv. I'm like 2/3 of the way there. But I need to get back into Greek because I do think it's helpful. I think some people overemphasize it, but I do think others underemphasize it as well. The which one is it in Philippians? Now you got me curious. Is it day? Gar. Yep. Theos Gar. Yeah. No, that's good stuff. And it's funny, actually, in my Greek studies, I've learned that the conjunctions, prepositions, very small words sometimes are the most important ones. Henna clauses, things like that. Very good point, Rafe. And you don't even really have to know, like, a vast amount of vocabulary, right? You can go to your lexicon for that. But just understanding the concepts behind. What are the tenses? What do they mean? What do each of the conjunctions mean? What's a henna clause? All of those basic fundamentals can really open up the scriptures. Okay. I'm just struggling with where I want to go with this. I might want to go with this next, because this is a lot of explanation again. I haven't illustrated or applied for a while. And so let me... I think this is good. I think this is a good spot. I can say that fear is only appropriate towards God, otherwise it's bent and it becomes sinful. It is not right, essentially, for Christians to fear almost anything else except for God. And it's kind of like hope, love, compassion. It's kind of like all those things. All those things are good when directed towards God, but they can become bad when directed towards other things. I don't know if I want to go there or not. It's just an idea right now. I might get rid of them. Man, this seemed really insightful when I came up with it earlier. Why does it feel blah now? What did I say earlier when I came up with this? I remember where I was at. I was in that journal article. This is where I was at, wasn't I? No, I wasn't here. Wasn't here. Here's where I was at. The Journal of Biblical Counseling. The Wheres and Whys of Human Behavior. Who or what is your functional God? That's the key here. Many of the questions simply derive from the verbs that relate you to God: love, trust, fear, hope, seek, obey, take refuge, the like. Each verb holds out a lamp to guide us to Him who is way, truth, and life, but each verb also may be turned into a question holding up a mirror. The questions that follow are why questions, framed concretely as what questions. These questions can help you draw out specific direction in a person's life. These are going to be good for application. The idea of a functional God, though, I think is important here. Functional God. There we go. I was trying to get it to seat in the middle of that arrow and it didn't want to do it. So that's the issue. What's your functional God? Now, how can I turn this into a good illustration application? Maybe I could run back to the disciples. You see, in the first time they're afraid because their functional God is their life. Death is something they're so fearful for. The disciples, their lives. Maybe I don't need to go into hope and love and all that junk. Maybe I just need to maybe now is when I go into the distinction between types of fears. Fear over events, or where did it go? I had one where it was I had fear over events, but I also had fear, like a fearful attitude or fearful state of mind. I might have used it over here. See, what I'm doing a lot during this time is I'm trying to work out transitions in my head. How am I logically going from one unit of discussion to another one? Like, how do I do that in a way that makes sense and flows well? I've essentially proved the point that fear is only appropriate towards God, and really what happens when you're fearing other things that aren't God is that you've made other things to be your functional God. These things could be hope, love, life, happiness, and when they're threatened, you become fearful over that. I think maybe the idea of talking about a fearful person in general should all go up here. At least with some of the ideas that I have up here, because I have like control and fear. I think there are two types of fearful people that fear in a negative sense. At least this is what I'm thinking of right now. There are people who fear over certain events. They're not generally fearful, but once in a while an event comes up and they're afraid of it, right? So again, grandma gets cancer or something like that, and fear creeps up. We have one response for that. But we also have an issue where there are people who generally have broad levels of fear, like anxiety disorders and depression disorders. And fear for them is more fundamental to who they are. And I think that fear is due to control. I think oftentimes they need to feel like they're in control, and they're fearful when they're not in control. And the fact of the matter is there are a lot of things that will help you to demonstrate in your life that you're not in control. And I think a lot of the people who have anxiety and depression and those types of disorders have a strong component of control associated with their fear. And that's kind of a different topic. I think both will have the same solution, but it's a lot easier if you're fearful over a certain event to just be reminded of the fact that God is sovereign than it is if you have a habitual and sustained level of fear due to lack of control. And that is where this change of perspective, this mindset shift, can come into play that I was talking about earlier. And I had mentioned earlier, how can people change their perspective? Two ways. Interacting with others. Reading. Interacting with others. Because reading is just interacting with others, but it's done so with people you're not in direct contact with. Because God does not want us to fear, we must exercise faith to cast it out. But now have I made the solution interacting with others instead of faith? Well, faith is the perspective they need. So I haven't. I've made interacting with others the tool to increase your faith. And I think that's biblical. What's the, I believe, help my unbelief? What passage is that? I feel like a terrible pastor sometimes because I don't know my Bible half as well as I should. And Logos makes me lazy, and I just use Logos to find the answer. Mark 9:24. Mark 9:24. Thank you, Rafe. Good work. I think that's a good logical flow. You're struggling with perpetual anxiety and depression. You're afraid, you're fearful on a fundamental level because you're not in control. Now, the answer to that is you need to believe that God is in control and He's got your back. But if you've worked with people who have anxiety and depression at all, you know that just telling them that, it doesn't help them, right? They don't know what to do with that. Just believe. Again, that's abstract. I was talking earlier about abstracts versus concretes. That's abstract. So instead, we need to seek to change our perspective, right? It's the change of perspective. And how can people change their perspective? They can do so by interacting with others. That's the easiest and best way to change perspective. And this interacting with others is actually increasing your faith. Your lack of faith is your inability to believe that. You're not believing it. But you want to believe it. There's something in you that's not believing it. And it's that part of you needs to interact with others so that your perspective is changed. I think that flows well. And I think that can answer some of these questions up here. Oh, here was my fear in general. Fear over certain events and fear in general. I think fear in general goes up here for now. It's funny, because the sense in which we're biblically supposed to fear becomes the answer to the unbiblical fears. It like solves that problem. Putting God at the center, trusting in God, solves the issue of which type of fear we should have. He's the solution. That is how faith cures fear, is fearing appropriately. A lot of these aren't how faith cures fear. A lot of these are dealing with the generalized anxiety disorder fear in general. Maybe I need a fourth point. I like how this flows up until now. Let me turn this into 4. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn this, I'm going to keep this down here. I'm going to turn this into 4 and call it, why do Christians still struggle with fear? Question mark. And I'm going to make this a 4th point. And I might have to reorient some of these ideas. I think I liked it better the other way. But I think this is getting closer to what I've turned this point up here into. And then I can make this 3rd point down here, because I've almost gotten there with the 3rd point. Essentially, this point 2 is almost done, and I've almost gotten there with the 3rd point. So I think this is what we're going to do. Yeah, this will be good. So what I'll do is, up until point number 3, essentially, I'm going to be saying, this is the general answer to fear biblically, and this is what we should do. But there's going to be a sense in which I get to the end of point 3, and the people in my audience who are really struggling hard with depression and anxiety are going to kind of feel bad that I didn't touch on any of that stuff. That I essentially told them, this is the biblical answer to fear, so implement the biblical answer. And I know in the back of their heads they're going to be going, yeah, but how? I don't know how to do it. And that's when I can go into point number 4, hidden point number 4. Why do Christians still struggle with fear? And I can talk about the different drugs and medications that people use. I'm not going to demonize them. I'm talking about how they can be helpful at certain times, but they're also not the answer. And that Scripture genuinely gives an antidote to our fearfulness. And then I can go into this as kind of the conclusion of my sermon. Increase your faith. How do you increase your faith? You're going to increase your faith by interacting with others because they're going to change your perspective. And I've noticed that actually in people who have anxiety and depression, they tend to isolate themselves. Oh dear. 1 second. I think I accidentally unplugged my monitor with my foot. Don't want to do that. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. So, I think what that will do is that will help people kind of for my final application. Now it's funny because I already sent out the notes for my main points, and I need to move all my stream and everything over now. Sorry about that, guys. Don't unplug your monitor. At least I didn't unplug my computer, right? That would have been worse. That would have been substantially worse. Here's my chat. Rafe says, good plan. Thank you, Rafe. I think it'll flow nicely. Okay, I think I got everything sorted. Again, do not unplug your monitor, but better than unplugging your computer. Okay, so how does faith cure fear? Faith cures fear because we functionally now have the right God. It reorients us. How does faith cure fear? It reorients us. Let's see. To have the proper perspective, right? It gives us that proper perspective. But do I want to go into perspective yet? I need to get rid of this now. So what I think I'm going to talk about, I might put this at the end here. Might make this orange and it goes here. Because I'm going to kind of proceed, I think, up until the end of point 3 with a hidden implicit assumption that I'm talking about faith from a... I'm sorry, I'm talking about fear from a individual certain event standpoint. And I'm not talking about it as a generalized perspective. So I might put it here at the end. So how does faith cure fear? So faith, well, let's think about it. What was Jesus upset that they didn't have faith about in the text? If we go back to Mark, not Peter, Mark 4. Jesus was upset that they didn't have faith. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? He implies the faith, if they had faith, they wouldn't be afraid. But what do they lack faith in? I think they lack faith in Jesus. They lack faith that Jesus is who he says he is. They lack faith of all of those things. But some way implicitly, no, I think they lack faith in God that Jesus is the Messiah, at least yet. They don't believe that God has sent the right person, or they don't believe that the person God has sent is capable of doing what he's capable of doing. That might be the issue. They're fearful for death. I think the answer is faith cures fear because the faith is exercised in God, which places our fear in the right category. And again, I have to describe that this fear is not what you would think fear is. How did Rafe put it? I'm going to just steal what Rafe said. Creator-creature distinction in one's worldview. That's got to go in there, buddy. You helped me write the sermon. I'll have to give you credit. A recognition of the creator-creature distinction in one's worldview. So, faith itself actually becomes just fearing the right thing. Now, I can't say it like this. People aren't going to understand those theological words. But that's the concept I need people to see. I know we're getting there. We're just not quite 100% there. But once this point falls into place, this point's almost done. I almost already know what to say in this whole last point. So this is really we're at the final stretch. This is the hardest work. How does faith cure fear? Faith cures fear because it's actually fear that cures fear. Fearing God cures fear of everything else. And what does it mean to fear God? This is what it means to fear God. Fear cures fear. And what does that fear do? It's what we said over here. I like it. This is how faith cures fear. And then now I need to apply it. I need to talk about why does this matter? Well, if you believe that God is at the center and not you, now all of a sudden the things you were afraid about, you're not afraid about anymore. Let's say you're afraid of dying. Well, that was in God's plan, and God has fixed a certain aspect of that. Let's say you were fearful of a loved one dying. Same thing. Let's say you were fearful of not getting a job or a promotion. All of these are your faith that God has a good plan for you, and He loves you and wants the best for you. This faith cures our fear of things that aren't God. And then I can say, now this is fear over certain events. Something comes up. But some of you have a chronic fear. Fear in general. You're a fearful person. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I just mean you struggle constantly with anxiety and fear. Generalized anxiety disorder. And if you're a Christian and you hear what I just said, you might feel very upset. You might be discouraged. And I don't want you to be discouraged here today. And then that's when I can go into the other ideas that I talked about. And then this last point is just going to be very pastoral, I think. And I don't even need to reference a verse for this last point because I've already talked about verse 40. I'll just go straight into this. So it'll kind of be like a false ending. I'll get to here and be like, this is how it cures fear, blah, 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 blah. And then I'm going to basically say, but this is for fear over certain events. This is if you are not a generally fearful person, but something comes up in your life that has made you afraid. This is how you resolve it. But I know I've got a lot of people out there who are generally fearful. What should you guys do? And that's what I can go into point 4. All right. I may be slow on the uptake, but I think this is going to sort out pretty well. This is a quote, so it needs to be pink. It's not a quote, it's an illustration. I'm just stealing it from Jordan Peterson. I need to be very careful in this area because it's going to hit home for a lot of people, and you need to do this in a pastoral tone. You can't just come in guns blazing, try to drop the hammer on people. That's not going to help. But I think I can get there. And I think this is where we need to talk about control. I think people who are perpetually fearful have control issues. And I'm not going to put it like that because that sounds pejorative too. But I think there's a very strong sense of control associated with a fearful disposition. And it's hard because that sense of control runs directly counter to this whole recognition of creator-creature distinction. What did I do? Oh, there we go. What was our Proverbs 3 again? Proverbs 3, 7 to 8. I want to make sure I'm not cutting out anything that I shouldn't. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones. Yeah, it doesn't fit in with where I'm going. It's true. It would go like somewhere right in here, but I proved the point elsewhere. I don't even think I need to talk about male-female distinctions. I think the people who are struggling with it regardless of their gender. Submitting the mind to Christ. This is important. This is going to go into I think this can go as well. It's coming together. Let's see. So, is there a sense in which we should fear? Yes, I prove it. We should fear God, but nothing else. And this is about functional gods. How then does faith cure fear? It reorients us. Fear cures fear goes later. This is too much of a hammer. It reorients us. Places God at the center. That's how faith cures fear. Places God at the center. Then I'm going to quote theologian Rafe Anderson, a recognition of the creator-creature distinction in one's worldview. And then I'll say it's about submitting the mind to Christ. Oh no, this has to go with my fear cures fear point. Because that's what fear is. Right. Oh man. So I need to give a couple examples. Places God at center. Submitting the mind to Christ. This can go here, I think. How does faith cure fear? It reorients us, it places God at the center, and it submits the mind to Christ. So how does this look? I want to tie it in cleanly to Tremper Longman's quote. One who fears God recognizes that God, not oneself, is at the center of the cosmos. That's what fear of the Lord is. In the end, okay, so I can say these three things. Faith cures fear through these three things. And ultimately, what are these three things? Except for the fear of the Lord. They're the same. Faith equals fear of the Lord. Oh, caps lock. Faith equals fear of the Lord. That'll remind me to talk about Tremper Longman. Just put it in just in case so I don't forget. And then that's when I can say fear cures fear. That it turns out the antidote to fear is fear, but fearing the right things, fearing God. I'm gonna say this quote, Rafe. I'm like 95% sure I'm gonna say it, and I'm gonna say it just like that. So it reorients us. It places God at the center. We're submitting the mind to Christ. Faith ultimately works out to fear of the Lord. And what was fear of the Lord? Tremper Longman just told us. One who fears God recognizes that God, not oneself, is at the center of the cosmos. You see, the reorienting, the placing God at center, that is what faith is, and it's also what fear is. Fear actually, in the long term, ends up curing fear. The fear that you have of drowning in the ocean due to the sailboat disciples actually gets cured by fearing the Lord, putting Him at the center of your worldview. This is a recognition of the creator-creature distinction. Yeah, this is a perfect way to put it for like theologians, right? For people who know this biblical terminology and all that type of stuff and the theological terminology, but I don't think it'll fly for. I don't think it's gonna fly for general audience. And then now I gotta make it practical because I've been like talking abstract for like minutes now. Here's the other. I do not have a lot of pink or purple in here. That's not good. Maybe I can spend a lot more time on the functional God part. Let's make this pink and just spend a lot more time talking about it. Because I need an illustrative or a application-oriented bent here. And then this is an abstract idea. I think it'll be good. And then now I need to get into some more of this. So what do you fear? And the answer to it is going to be fear the Lord instead. What does that mean practically? It means put His glasses on instead of your own. Fear the Lord. And I need some examples of fears in here. So I'm in a Baptist context, so children not getting saved, for example, is something I think a lot of my parents in the congregation might fear. Not being a good father or mother. Or sister or brother, son or daughter. I'll just put family member. And that'll remind me to talk about all different types of family members. Maybe you fear not making enough money. And I can talk about more, but these are just examples. Instead, fear the Lord. Yepers, at least you do. At least I do what? I'm not sure. I've been rambling for several minutes, so I'm not sure to what you're referring. What do you fear? Fear the Lord. But then I need to give, I think, an illustration of how to do that. This is so abstract. This is my trouble with this stuff. It's so abstract. You tell somebody to fear the Lord, and they're kind of sitting there going, how? How do I fear the Lord? I think change your perspective is the answer to that. And I can say, well, see, the problem is I want to jump into all this stuff up here. What was my change your perspective? What was my book that told me to change perspective? I gotta find that one again. That was a good one. This one I'm good with. This one I'm good with. I don't think I needed that one. Use good old find. Doesn't look like it's in here. Oh, that's a great idea, Rafe. Rafe says, check the NIV application commentary on Proverbs for application on fear of the Lord. NIV app. Proverbs. I'll just put it over here for now since I'm not using my notes anymore. I mean, surely I'm going to do an inline search. Fear of the Lord. I mean, surely this is going to be in this one a bunch. Yeah, it's all over the place. There's a million places where it says fear of the Lord. So then I'm going to do near application. See if that helps. 0 results. Well, then we can go early on where it talks about fear of the Lord. So let's just do this. Fear of the Lord. Learning wisdom and fear of the Lord. Theological reflection. I don't want theological reflection. Got enough theological reflection. So also Proverbs urges fear of the Lord as the antidote to idolatry. Readers are to walk through this education and wisdom of the young man. Contemporary significance. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. While we acknowledge the Bible does not contain prepackaged responses to ethical questions or a finely scripted list of what believers should do in each and every situation, we also strongly affirm the Scripture canon does reveal knowledge of God and God's will for us. The book of Proverbs, the proper response to God, is summed up as fear the Lord, the beginning of wisdom that guides all a person's attitudes and actions. Wisdom in action is best described as a life of virtuous character that is a life of faithfulness. Ooh. So they're implying that fear the Lord is a life of virtuous character. Practicing a life of virtuous character. You fear the Lord, that gives you wisdom, and wisdom in action is demonstrated as a life of virtuous character, that is a life of faithfulness. Faithfulness D. Gill lists faithfulness as the first of the virtues in being good. Building moral character. So let's just call it this. Faithfulness. For now, I'm going to keep reading. Fear of Yahweh. Fear of the Lord is worshipful submission, reverent obedience. I probably need to mention Proverbs and talk. That's how I can get there. Fear the Lord, right? What do you fear? All these things. Instead of fearing those things, fear the Lord. And fearing the Lord is putting God at the center of the cosmos, not yourself. But what will that result in? Oh, you know what? Rafe, I appreciate that. I don't use the inline Bible search very much. If you change your menu from article to search results, you don't have to scroll through so much. Right here. That's awesome. Because I don't use the inline very much. And that breaks it up a little bit more. Perfect. Thank you. Logger is a powerful tool, and it's hard to know all of the details of how to use it well. So I can link this to Proverbs. How does faith cure fear? You end up fearing the Lord instead. You're directing your fear appropriately. Where do we learn a lot about fearing the Lord? We learn it in the book of Proverbs. And what is the fear of the Lord equated to in the book of Proverbs? It's equated to faithfulness. It's equated to moral character and virtue. So, taking action in your life to cultivate moral character and virtue, to be faithful, will help you with your fear. I'm going to dig a little more. That might be good, but I'm going to dig a little bit more. Are you afraid of your children not being saved? Be faithful. Show up. Cultivate moral character and virtue. Are you faithful of not being a good family member? Or fearful of not being a good family member? Be faithful. Fearful of not making enough money? Be faithful. Feels close. I know it's biblical. Let's keep going. Phrases especially prominent in Proverbs. Up and down arrows. Nice. Oh, and so this jumps to each one. That's great. While the biblical books we call wisdom's books recommend fear of the Lord, the phrase is especially prominent in Proverbs. For today's Christian, the fear of the Lord also means that one has made the foundational decision to trust in Jesus as Lord of one's life. To say that we believe in Jesus, but to refuse to acknowledge him as Lord of creation and Lord of our lives is to live like the fool. So that's not wrong, but simplistic. Just as the fear of the Lord turns our reference point away from ourselves as the final authority, so faithfulness turns our attention toward others. See, this sums up the whole fear of the Lord thing. Not fear of the Lord, but the faithfulness aspect. Putting God at the center turns our reference point away from ourselves. Faithfulness turns our attention towards others as we seek to practice the social virtues of righteousness, justice, and fairness. It's interesting. You know, that does kind of, I feel like that does solve a lot of, I don't know if solve's the right word, but a lot of issues we have as believers, especially surrounding fear or being fearful. If we shift our perspective from being inwardly focused or focused on the areas of my life to not only being God focused, but then others focused, our problems don't seem as big. They kind of tend to shrink and fade away. I think that's an interesting idea. I think this will go. I'm going to read a little more on it, but I think this will go right here. And that's how faith cures fear. And then I'll say one final thing. This is fear over certain events. This is how faith cures certain events of fear in our lives. But some of you are fearful people, fearful in general. And telling you to do these things doesn't necessarily solve your problem, right? I want to now answer the question, why do Christians still struggle with fear? If this were simple, if this were easy to do, you as a Christian would have already done it, and it'd be done. But it's not. And so, why do Christians still struggle with fear? Fear in general. Generalized anxiety disorder. I'll talk about drugs. I'll talk about how Christians tend to demonize medications and how we need to provide real help. Don't tell people, just don't worry about it or trust in God. We need to provide real help for them. But we also have to recognize what Scripture says. And Scripture over and over and over talks about how we don't have to be afraid. The Bible repeatedly holds out the possibility, sometimes phrases command, that those who trust in God are exempt from being afraid. It's there. How do we do justice to both of these things? How do we do justice to the fact that Scripture says you don't have to be afraid, and yet you're a Bible-believing Christian who's trying their best and you're still afraid all the time? How can we deal with that? That's how we get into this. These are my answers to all that. Let's see. And then this is where this quote comes in. Large scientific body of research suggests that mindfulness has a positive impact on a variety of mental health symptoms, such as stress, anxiety, and some personality disorders. The research shows that changing an individual's perception and mindset about reality, even such things as oneself, other people, physical health, and mental disorders, improves brain function and one's health. For example, anxiety is not necessarily seen as a problem. It is only a problem if one thinks of it as a problem. In other words, if anxiety is viewed from a different perspective, one is changing the reality of the problem. But what does the brain have to do with mindfulness? How and why did the convergence between brain biology and mindfulness occur? I really think this is going to be helpful for people in my category that I'm talking about now. Now, I don't think I'll have time to go into all this. A sermon can't be about everything. That's the other thing I've got to remember. You can't preach about all things. So I'll be here and I'll say there's a large element of control that's associated. I can talk about how change of perspective is important. Because I think I've got enough to just end here. Now, I don't know if that's where I want to end. Interact with others. People in your life, people in your church, and by reading. Both of those things will change your perspective. Where did I get this from again? I think it was in here. Let's just do a quick search on open. Let's just search this real quick. It was that conspectus one that I closed. One issue that has captured the attention of many scientists over the years is whether brain states are associated with consciousness, contemplation, and mystical experiences. This is no surprise, considering that Buddhist monks have pursued meditation for about 2.5 millennia. The advent of neuroimaging or brain scanning technology, blah blah blah. Can't study the brain directly, blah blah blah. This is very detailed. Meditation. Wow, I need to probably read this whole article just to get a good feel for it. Again, how not to do research. Scroll to the bottom and see what the conclusions are. Wow, this is very detailed. What are Christian physicalists telling us about the immaterial person when they're using biology, the brain, nervous system? Yeah, this is like an apologetic argument or something. What is a more appropriate, as opposed to only, approach to spiritual transformation? The first point pertains to the inseparable connections between belief, character, and action. At the outset, one must acknowledge that beliefs are not blind. The belief's impact on one's action will also depend on the intensity with which the belief is held. This might be helpful. If beliefs influence our thinking, action, and character formation, how can a person change his or her beliefs about something? Obviously, various options are available. A person can embark on a course of study, think about certain things, gather evidence and ponder arguments in favor or against a particular point of view, and try various ways to find a solution to the problem. The point we have to see is this: if the soul is a unity of faculties, mental, spiritual, and moral, then what happens in one will have an effect on the others. In other words, intellectual growth can exert influence on all other aspects of the self. In conclusion, philosophical and religious assumptions that underline scientific views of ourself and spiritual growth matter enormously. They deserve continual scrutiny. I like this. This essentially appeals to the idea that we're a whole person. And I've been wrestling in point number 4 with, I tell people to believe differently, right? Told them to fear the Lord, not to fear these other things. But how do I just believe? Well, there's actually a variety of ways to do it. And it's affected by all of these aspects that the article talks about. Our beliefs influence our thinking, action, and character formation. How can a person change his or her beliefs about something? The soul is a unity of faculties, mental, spiritual, and moral. That's where this Proverbs thing comes in. Acting morally different will affect your beliefs. Oh man, this just got more complicated. Let me think. Maybe this goes. Maybe I leave it at fear the Lord right here. And I say, fear the Lord, change your beliefs. Hold on. And then I embark on this moral character and virtue development up here. Maybe that just needs to be stated explicitly. Change your beliefs. Now, of course, I'm not going to leave them with that, right? I'm not just going to be like, change your beliefs. It's that simple. going to say change your beliefs, and then I'm going to say, and changing your beliefs is hard, right? Now, do I want to put that? I think I can include that up here. Maybe I need to open with a statement then why do Christians still struggle with fear? Because changing your beliefs is hard and complicated. And in that sense, I'm not talking about fear in general, but I'm talking about fear over certain events. Talking about both types of fear really now. Let me think though. I think this might actually work because for people who have fear over certain events, changing your beliefs really might be the answer. And they might be able to do it if you just tell them to. They might be able to do it because they don't have like a chronic problem with this idea of their beliefs needing to be changed, right? And then I can say, this is for those of us who have fear over certain events. But for some of us, we don't have fear over certain events. We have fear in general. We're fearful people. And for those of us who are fearful people who have fear in general, changing your beliefs is hard and difficult. And you would have done it already if you could. I think that's faithful to the text. It's hard because you have to reconcile with the fact that that is what's going on here. The solution to your fear is to change your beliefs. That's what Jesus is indicating. That's what the Bible says. But in practice, it doesn't seem to work for some of us. And so I think that's where this point will come in. What if change your beliefs seems impossible? What do you do then? Then you have fear in general. You might have generalized anxiety disorder. You might think the answer is drugs. Well, I want to speak to that for a moment. But we need to provide these people with real help. We don't need to tell them don't worry about it or just trust God. But we also have to recognize what Scripture says. Scripture says, holds out hope that Christians are exempt from being afraid. I think fear for these people is often associated with control. And the answer is the same. We need to change our beliefs. We need to change our perspective. But how can these people do it? I think this will work. I'm going to put perspective here just because that's the language I've been using. I didn't want to reveal it this early, but I do think it'll help. Now here's the unique thing. These people can change their perspective by just like stopping, thinking about it, all that type of stuff. But these people can't change their perspective so easily. And so how can these people change their perspective? By interacting with others. This is your tool to increase your faith. And by acting out faithfulness, they might have to do the Proverbs thing more than these people do. So I'll have kind of two pieces of advice for those who are struggling with generalized anxiety disorder or anxiety and depression. And the two pieces will be, how can you gain fear of the Lord? You might have to go the step further and implement Proverbs in your life, and you might need to be interacting with others, and that includes reading, because you need a more radical way of changing your perspective. Why will these help you change your perspective more than just saying change your perspective will? Because you're a whole person. You're a whole person with mental, spiritual, and moral components to you. And so what happens in one of your areas has an effect on the other. Proverbs says if you want to embrace the fear of the Lord, you must act. You must act wisely, virtuously. So you need to act wisely and virtuously. You need to express faithfulness. That might help. Also, you need to interact with others. When you have anxiety and depression, you tend to isolate yourself. But that's the exact opposite of the antidote or cure for you. Again, what's our goal? It's to change your perspective. One of the best ways you can change your perspective is through interacting with others. You can do that directly with people at church, at work, in school, but you can also do that indirectly through reading. That helps you change your perspective. The solution's the same. You need to change your perspective. But some people are able to do that very easily, and some people, it's very, very difficult, and they need to leverage every tool that they have at their disposal in order to do it. I think that's the answer. I think we nailed it. So let's change your perspective again, but I'm going to flesh it out a lot more for this group. Then I want to ask this question: how can people change their perspective? So I'm going to break this quote up too. And I'm actually going to read some of it in the sermon. I don't like doing big quotes like this, but I'm going to do quote 1 right here. Change your perspective. And then I'm going to read this quote, which essentially says how great it is for people who struggle with these things to change their perspective. And then quote 1, and then I'm going to say, hold on, I just had it in my head. I'm going to read quote 1, and then I'm going to talk about therapy. And I could say this is why therapy works so well, because it helps you change your perspective. No, I'll just read quote 1, and then I will talk about, I'll ask this question. And then I will go to my 2 answers. Interact with others and act faithfully. Oh man, that moment when you start encroaching on your intro. You gotta move everything over. These are the two applications. This is the tool to increase your faith. These are the tools. Also read. Now what I'll do is interact with others. I'm going to split these out. First, interact with others, and you can do that, and then I can talk about therapy, and I can talk about reading. Therapy and reading. And then I can talk about live faithfully. And that'll be Proverbs. And then I think that's going to do it. Now, is this Christological enough? That's the other thing I got to ask. Because Brian Chappell always teaches you gotta throw Jesus in there, and he doesn't mean tack it on at the end either. But it's a balance, right? Like, I want to provide real help. And while Jesus is the reason any of this works, the real help behind it goes deeper than that. I think I'm going to end with this. These are the tools to increase your faith. I believe, help my unbelief. And why does living faithfully work? It works because you're a whole person. You're not just a brain on a stick. Living differently will affect your mindset as well. Affects all of who you are. Quote 1. If the soul is a unity of faculties, mental, spiritual, and moral, then what happens in one will have an effect on the others. In other words, intellectual growth can exert influence on all other aspects of the self. This will be my quote 2. And what I'll essentially say is these mutually inform each other. And what's this conspectus article called? Mindfulness and the Brain, a Christian critique of some aspects of neuroscience. Both these quotes are from there, so that'll be good. They're both coming in at the end. By Kelly Joubert. And so what I'll say when I give quote 2 is, this is why just living differently, living faithfully, will help you to embody fearing the Lord, which will help you to actually fear the Lord intellectually, which is God's answer to your fear. All right, guys, I think it's done. I think it is done. Just roll through it real quick. Here's the verse. I'm going to open with an illustration on the matrix. I'm going to talk about the agents, how you run away from agents all the time, Neo and Mr. Smith, and then at the train station at the end of the movie, he turns to fight Mr. Smith. Trinity asks, what is he doing? Morpheus says he's beginning to believe. You see, every member of the Matrix was afraid of agents, terrified of agents from the beginning. And they should have been afraid of the agents. But it was his faith that made him no longer afraid. Morpheus says he's beginning to believe. He no longer has to fear because he now has faith. And that's not unlike our text this morning. Jesus makes very, very clear that faith casts out fear. So our proposition, because God does not want us to fear, we must exercise faith to cast it out. We've got 3 main points. Why doesn't he want us to fear? Is there a sense in which we should fear? And how does faith cure fear? And I've got a hidden 4th point. Why do Christians still struggle with fear? But this one won't be on their notes. So first, why doesn't he want us to fear? I'm going to talk about these passages on fear, talk about how biblical it is, how biblical persons fear for a variety of reasons. I'm going to talk about how we're all afraid of different things. And I want to talk about the impact of fear and anxiety, the things it does to us that are negative. I got each of these. I can emphasize all these aspects. And I'm going to say, but there's a sense in which we should fear, right? What does the Bible say? Well, there are different types of fear. We can see that in verses 40 and 41. They fear in one way, then they fear in a different way. And there are a bunch of passages that say we should fear, and I'll just read these. What fears are healthy and which ones aren't? How can we determine? How can we determine if it's a bad fear or a good fear? Well, the fear has to do with reverence for God. That's the difference. And so I need to emphasize that the text itself points that out. What are they afraid of first? And then what are these good godly fears? These all have to do with God, whereas their fears were fears of death. And then I can relate back to Philippians 2:13. Remember, it says, it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Then I can read Tremper Longman's quote, and I can emphasize, see, fear is only proper if it's exercised towards God. Otherwise it's bent, it becomes sinful. The question is, what is your functional God going to be? Whatever you fear is actually your functional God. Is hope your functional God? Well, you're hoping for certain things to happen, and you're fearful, therefore, if they don't happen. Is love your functional God? You want to love these sorts of things? Oh no, that's not what I used these for. I was using hope and love not as functional gods, but I was using them as examples of the sorts of things that if they get bent, they also become sinful. So I can talk about that. Then I will say, okay then, so there is a sense in which we should fear, and it's fear of God. Well then, how does faith cure fear? Well, it reorients us, it places God at the center, and it submits to the mind of Christ, or it's submitting our mind to Christ. I wonder if fear cures fear should go at the beginning then, because I need to relate it to faith. Yes, there's a sense in which we should fear. What's your functional God? Who's at the center? No, that'll be okay. I think this answer's on its own. It can stand on its own. Then I'll go to this. Then I can do the big reveal here on that one. Submitting the mind of Christ, all these different things. Recognition of the creator-creature distinction. We'll talk about what do you fear? Fear the Lord instead. You need to change your perspective. Now this works for those who fear certain events, but what about those of us who, for us to change our beliefs or change our perspective seems impossible? What about them? These people have a chronic fear. They have fear in general. In fact, many in this category have an anxiety disorder. What do we do with that? Well, are drugs the answer? Blah, blah, blah. Jordan Peterson quote. Problem is, we need to give these people real help. But we also have to recognize what Scripture says. Christians aren't meant to be fearful. That's not how God has built us. So how do we deal with that? Well, fear has to do largely with control. And you need to change your perspective as well. But there's this quote that I think is helpful for changing our perspective. Now, how can people change their perspective? They can interact with others. This is why therapy works, and also reading is a way of interacting with others. And then we can live faithfully. If you think about it, we're trying to change our fear from certain things to fear of the Lord. Proverbs is a book completely devoted to that, and it talks constantly about living faithfully. That is how you exercise the fear of the Lord in Proverbs, and therefore it can help you as well. Why would it help you as well? It's well because you're a whole person. These are your tools to increase your faith. Remember the man who said, "I believe, help my unbelief." Some of you are struggling with that very thing this morning. These are the tools God has given us to grow our faith, to increase our faith. You believe, help your unbelief, will change your perspective. Do that by interacting with others faithfully and living faithfully. Boom. I think that'll go, guys. I'm going to deal with some of the details, right? I'll preach it to myself a couple times today and just work through some of the transitions, make sure it flows well. There might be some slight adjustments I make to it, but I think overall that's going to be the flow. And guys, this has been an epic one. I've been streaming for 3 hours, a little over 3 hours. If there are no questions, comments, or concerns, I'm probably going to jump off and take a break. Now, I think I'm going to come back on later today. I've been reading Mike Heiser on the Unseen Realm. And I need to keep reading this book. And so I might actually come on later and not do sermon prep, but just do the Unseen Realm and read this, because I've been reading through this book like crazy, and this is such a good book. And the reason I am reading through this book is Mark chapter 5 is the Gerasene demoniac, and I need to have some good information prepped for spiritual warfare. So if you guys are interested, I know I'm ending the stream now, but I might be back on later, and I might stream myself reading this book, if there's any interest at all. If there's not, I completely understand. But that's probably what I'm going to be doing the rest of the day, but it's been 3 hours of sermon prep. I need a little bit of a break. Let's see. Rafe says, I suffer from worry and anxiety, so this process was helpful. Thanks for the good study. Talk to you later. Thanks, Rafe. You know, I don't, and that's part of the problem of preaching this, is I don't suffer from anxiety. I don't suffer from depression or worry or any of those things. And so it's very, very tough as a preacher to relate to your audience when you don't suffer with the things that you're talking about. But I think the answers we came up with are biblical. I think they're related, and I think they're helpful. I think they'll be helpful for people that struggle with these things. And so, Rafe, I also really appreciate your interaction. It was so enjoyable. Normally, I can only get through about an hour to 2 hours of doing this by myself, and that's if I'm really well rested and feel really good. And just being able to interact with you energized me. I felt really good working on this whole thing. So thank you so much for your interaction. Like I said, I'm going to take a break now. I might be back on later. If I'm back on later, it's not going to be sermon prep. I'm just going to be reading The Unseen Realm. And I'll probably be listening to it on double speed and highlighting and just taking notes. So that's what I'll be doing. I hope you guys have a great Saturday. And I hope that the Lord blesses you. He prepares your heart for worship tomorrow so that you can worship Him in spirit and truth. And I will interact with you guys in the future. Take care, guys. Talk to you later. God bless. Bye now.